By the time the fragment hit the field outside Riverton, the sky above the town was perfectly clear and nobody heard a thing, which is the only reason the story almost ended there, buried under frost and tractor tracks. The cows didn't spook, the power didn't flicker, and the only anomaly that night was a brief streak on an all-sky camera at the University of Colorado, a bright pixel that flagged as possible meteor and was automatically filed away with thousands of others. If you listen to this to the end, you'll never again look at those routine sky maps like they're boring background data, because once you hear what was hiding in that one dropped frame, you'll understand how close we came to missing the first deliberate object ever delivered to Earth. Officially, 3IA/Atlas was still just the third confirmed interstellar visitor, a weird red point of light on a hyperbolic orbit that had started changing color in a way comets aren't supposed to, cycling from dull brick to almost electric copper in August, then to a cold, toxic green in September, and finally, by early November, to a deep violet that made spectroscopists swear their calibrations were wrong. Each shift came with a measurable jump in non-gravitational acceleration, like something on board was waking up in stages. But the public statements remained cautious: unusual outgassing, complex surface physics, exciting opportunity. Nothing that hinted at the way some people in the back rooms were quietly running stress test scenarios for Earth's magnetosphere. 2 floors below street level at the Goddard Space Flight Center, in a windowless monitoring room that always smelled faintly of burned coffee and ozone, astrophysicist Lena Morales stared at a time-lapse of 3IA/Atlas and felt the same wrongness you feel when a stranger on a bus says your name even though you never told them who you are. The object's color wasn't drifting the way dust and ice scattering normally do. It was jumping, clean cutoffs between phases, each one preceded by a silent radio hiss just at the edge of their instrument's sensitivity, like a system flipping modes. By the time the violet phase locked in, Lena had a notebook full of this-makes-no-sense scribbles and an email from her boss telling her to tone down the language in internal memos, because word had filtered up that one of her charts comparing 3IA/Atlas's color jumps to a multi-stage ignition profile had made a program manager visibly pale. On the other side of the continent, in that empty Riverton field, high school physics teacher and hobbyist skywatcher Tom Reyes parked his pickup, propped his phone on the hood to film a time-lapse of Orion, and caught, purely by chance, the last 2 frames of the fragment's descent. An angled blur, then nothing. No flash, no explosion, just a vanishing streak. He almost deleted the clip until he zoomed in and saw the color, not the white-green of a meteor, not the orange of re-entering debris, but the same impossible violet he'd seen in a NASA press image earlier that day. Something in his chest tightened, a quiet animal instinct whispering that whatever had just fallen out there in the grass was not finished with its journey. He killed the engine, grabbed his flashlight, and walked into the dark. The crunch of frost loud under his boots, the silence around him suddenly heavy, like the air was waiting. He found it by the way the beam of his flashlight died before it touched the ground, absorbed by something that shouldn't have been there. A smooth, fist-sized object. When the first spectropolarimetric data arrived from the Keck Observatory in late December 2025, most astronomers expected the readings to confirm what they already believed. 3I/ATLS was behaving like an unusually volatile interstellar object, nothing more. Instead, the measurements introduced a new layer of mystery that overturned even the most cautious assumptions. The polarization curve didn't merely shift in amplitude, it oscillated, rhythmic, steady, as if responding to an internal cycle rather than external illumination. Natural bodies can flicker when tumbling or shedding dust, but this oscillation was too consistent, repeating at intervals of roughly 140 seconds with an almost metronomic precision. The curve rose, dipped, and rose again, like a heartbeat filtered through a machine.
Analysts compared the oscillation to K1 Atlas's final recorded plume variations, and although the patterns weren't identical, they shared the same strange trait: periodic intensity changes that refused to align with any known rotational or thermal models. Something inside both objects seemed to pulse, not chaotically like sublimation jets, but methodically. When the team attempted to model the oscillations using typical cometary dynamics, the simulations broke down. The only configurations that reproduced the observed pattern required asymmetric mass distribution with internal cavities that opened and closed at precise intervals, as though something beneath the surface was breathing. Then came the thermal anomaly. Infrared imaging from NEOWISE detected a warming signature around 3I, but not a gradual thermal buildup from solar heating. Instead, the warming pattern expanded outward from a central point, spreading across the object's surface in a spiral wave, like heat propagating through engineered conduits. The wave took exactly 18.4 seconds to complete one full rotation, repeating every 3 minutes with an unnerving regularity. No natural comet produces thermal spirals with this consistency. The report, initially marked internal only, described the effect as non-random thermodynamic zonal activation, a phrase so vague it bordered on meaningless, yet chosen deliberately to avoid triggering the media frenzy the scientists feared. But the real shock came when ESA researchers overlapped the thermal activation cycle with the polarization oscillations. The cycles synced. The thermal wave rotated at the exact interval that the polarization signal peaked. Two different phenomena, light scattering and heat emission, moving together in perfect mechanical harmony. That shouldn't be possible unless the internal process driving them was unified. Not random, not chaotic, coordinated. The possibility chilled the team into silence. Some argued that it could be a bizarre resonance effect, internal cavities filled with volatile gas producing rhythmic expansions as the body heated. But even those arguments felt strained, artificial, desperate to avoid the implication that the object was behaving like a system rather than a rock. The patch of space where it ought to be was as clean and empty as if nothing had ever passed through. At the exact same second, in the lab, the fragment's halo flared into a deep, blood-threaded crimson that made people flinch and shield their eyes, then collapsed, not to darkness, but to a steady, low pulsing that synced with no known terrestrial rhythm. For a heartbeat that felt like the entire planet inhaling, nothing else happened. No EMP, no blast, no voice booming in all languages. Then, one by one, devices around the world that had no business being connected to each other began to glitch in the same distinctive way. A half-second of freeze, then a soft restart, as if they'd all been pinged by something that reached inside the stack, touched the core, and withdrew. Aircraft avionics, smart fridges, server farms, old ham rigs, undersea cable repeaters, all of them logging the same millisecond-long anomaly that left no malware, no altered files, just a fingerprint of timing anyone who knew where to look could see. In the days that followed, official explanations flowed like water: solar flare, benign cosmic ray shower, coincidence layered on coincidence. The fragment was moved again to a deeper, darker place, and all but a handful of people were told it had stabilized, that whatever danger it represented had passed. But for Lena, for Tom back on his farm, for the analyst in data fusion, the aftertaste wouldn't fade. Tom went back to his classes and his cows, pretending not to notice that the stars overhead looked different now. Not in position, but in context, like a background you suddenly realize is a painting, not a window. Lena returned to her charts and models, but every time she plotted a new anomaly, her first treacherous thought was, what if this is a follow-up? The analyst, rocking her baby to sleep at night, would catch herself counting her child's slow breaths and hearing, faintly over the monitor's white noise, the ghost of burst and hiss sequences she'd memorized without meaning to. Officially, 3I.ATLAS is still classified as a disruptive interstellar object with anomalous non-gravitational acceleration. Unofficially, in the whisper network of people who saw the unedited data, it's something else. The first time the galaxy knocked and didn't wait for us to open the door. Whether what passed through that fragment into our networks was a map, a question, a seed program, or just a ping that says, "We see you," is still an open problem, parceled out into NDAs and compartmentalized projects. You're not going to get a neat moral here, no tidy "and so humanity learned" ending. What you get instead is this. The next time you see a headline about a weird object changing color in deep space, remember that once already we watched something ramp itself up in phases, violet, blue, white, red, and told ourselves it was just ice and dust. Remember that a piece of it fell silent into a sleeping field and woke up only when someone paid attention. And ask yourself, quietly, when the news tells you not to worry, whether the more frightening possibility is that the universe is hostile, or that it's interested, patient, and very, very good at making sure its messages arrive exactly where they're supposed to, whether we are ready or not. On the night analysts at the European Southern Observatory began reprocessing data from 2023 to 2024 sky sweeps, they expected noise, catalog errors, routine artifacts. What they found instead was a pattern, faint, near invisible deviations along a corridor of space that matched K1 Atlas's future trajectory almost perfectly, but years earlier, when no comet should have been there at all. These detections were nothing more than low-brightness specks, barely a whisker above the threshold of confirmation, but their motion vectors, when plotted, formed a thin, almost elegant curve through the void. Too clean to be random noise, too persistent across months to be a cosmic coincidence. And when they ran the orbital backtracking again with the updated fragmentation models of K1, something chilling happened. The projected inbound path of K1 aligned with these ghosts within 0.02 degrees, far tighter than any stochastic scatter expected from debris. It suggested something that astronomers did not want to admit publicly. If K1 was part of a stream, then the stream existed long before K1 brightened. It had already passed Earth's orbital window twice without anyone noticing. And the faintest detection from more complicated, threads of color twisting through it in patterns that felt almost like writing. Far above, telescopes registered a simultaneous microflare in 3I Atlas's white phase, a subtle but measurable uptick in its outbound burst and hiss signal. To anyone not looking for it, it was just another data point. To Lena, hunched over the laptop in the smell of hot dust and fear, it was confirmation. The fragment and the parent weren't just passively linked, they were part of a feedback loop, and she just poked it. There was a brief, dizzying sense of triumph, scientific discovery in its purest, most dangerous form, and then reality snapped back as gravel crunched outside and red and blue lights flickered through the garage windows. For a moment you think this is the part where the cavalry arrives, wise heads prevail, and the thing gets handed to people with more resources. Instead, the tension doubles, because the first agent through the door, vest bulging with gear, aimed not at them, but at the workbench, hand hovering near his sidearm like the fragment might leap. "Step away from the object," he said, voice rehearsed, eyes flicking to the white halo like it was a live grenade. There's a sick kind of comedy in watching a small government team, DHS patches, maybe a few others they didn't recognize, try to assert control over something that, by definition, didn't care about their jurisdiction. Laptops were seized, phones bagged, Lena's ID scanned while someone with "Science Advisor" on their badge peppered her with questions that makes genuine curiosity with clear intent to box the narrative before it leaked. Tom, stripped of illusion, watched strangers catalog his garage, his life, his cows, and felt something in him harden. The emotional pendulum swung from fear to anger, to a quiet, stubborn resolve. If they screw this up, we all pay. Outside, under a sky that looked brutally ordinary, the radio spectrum over Riverton lit with a growing storm of noise as more agencies tuned in, more instruments pointed, more transmitters came online. All that human chatter might as well have been static to 3i Atlas, which continued its inbound glide, its white phase growing more intense, its non-gravitational acceleration curve steepening like a power-up. As they loaded the fragment into a thick-walled container lined with materials Lena hadn't seen outside radiation labs, she caught a last glimpse of its halo, now threaded with faint red veins she hadn't seen before. At that exact second, the main body in space began to show the first hints of that same red at its edges, white core surrounded by a thin arterial glow. The final phase many of them had modeled as a hypothetical, if the object keeps ramping we might see a mode where, wasn't hypothetical anymore. Time compressed. Models flickered across command center screens showing closest approach windows tightening from weeks to days. The official line stayed bland, no impact risk, routine close pass. But inside the rooms where Lena was now being debriefed for 12 hours at a stretch, the tone shifted to pure crisis management. The fragment, now in a lab instead of a garage, pulsed in and out of invisibility in some instruments, as if parts of it were sliding between measurable states. Every burst 3i Atlas sent from deep space came with a faint delayed echo in the lab, as though the pace on Earth were a local node of a larger system, and the main body was dialing it in. If you've ever watched someone try to jam a signal they don't understand, you know what happened next. They started throwing noise at it. RF, lasers, magnetic pulses, hoping to drown it out, to degrade potential hostile functionality, as one white-haired man in a suit put it. And for a few hours, it looked like it might be working, the halo around the fragment dimming, the echo lagging, 3i Atlas's acceleration curve wobbling just enough for the wargamers to breathe. But an emotion visible beneath the surface, while his garage radio cut in and out, even when turned off, picking up bursts of static that seemed to pulse in sync with the slow, almost breathing rhythm of the object's shifting patterns. He tried moving it to the barn. The static followed. He tried wrapping it in more foil. The effect only dulled, like he'd put a pillow over a speaker. Every few hours, his phone buzzed with another 3i ATLS update from Space Nerd accounts he followed, each alert announcing fresh weirdness. The main body's light curve had smoothed into an almost perfectly regular pulse, its apparent mag decreasing faster than projections, as if it were shedding mass or reorienting panels no natural comet should have, and its color was drifting again, this time toward a white so pure the false color images looked blown out. The midpoint twist hit on a rural driveway under a big, empty sky. When Lena stepped out of the rental car and Tom saw the NASA badge on her lanyard, both of them felt a momentary wash of relief. Finally, someone who might understand. Finally, someone who's actually called us instead of shouting on Facebook. But it evaporated the second she saw the fragment in person. On the workbench, out of its box, it was no longer blue. It had taken on that impossible white from the latest 3i ATLS images, but with a faint halo of shifting color around it, like a miniature aurora that obeyed its own rules. Worse, when she moved her hand near it, the portable spectrometer on her laptop flashed error after error, unable to fix a baseline because the emission lines were sliding in real time. No naturally cooling rock does that. For a suspended few seconds, they just stared, Lena with scientific horror, Tom with a mixture of pride and dawning dread. Then the garage radio clicked itself on with a soft pop, even though its knob was turned all the way left, and a sound spilled out that wasn't quite static anymore. Short, precise bursts, each followed by a tiny hiss, a rhythm that matched the intervals in Lena's earlier spreadsheet. The fragment wasn't just synchronized in color with 3i ATLS, it was synchronized in whatever this was, a local echo of a signal bouncing off orbit and down into a farm. The narrative in your head flips here if you're really listening. Up to this point, it's been rock, weird rock, maybe even dangerous rock. Now it's something more uncomfortable, something that notices, that reacts, that sends and receives. In that garage, the stakes jumped quietly from "this might be hazardous" to "this might be contact." And neither Lena nor Tom was remotely prepared, because contact stories don't tell you what it feels like in your bones when the object you've been studying starts to behave like it has a schedule. Back in space, main body 3I ATLS, now white and bright enough to trigger automatic safety cutoffs on some telescopes, altered its course by a fraction of a degree, small enough to hide inside orbit uncertainties, big enough that when the corrections were applied, its projected path threaded closer to Earth than any model had previously dared suggest. Somewhere in a bunker, someone in uniform updated a briefing slide from zero impact risk to non-zero close approach, and somewhere in the data stream, a quiet pattern unfurled across radio and light. The same burst and hiss rhythm Lena was now hearing from the garage
catch a glare if they looked straight at it. He told himself animals spook at anything, that he was primed to see patterns because of the news alerts piling up on his phone. But when the sun went down and he lifted the trough just enough to peek, his breath stalled. The fragment surface was no longer that almost violet. It had shifted, now a kind of deep metallic blue, with faint ripples of teal sliding across it, like light moving under ice. At the same time, miles above the atmosphere, satellites tracking 3I-Atlas sent down fresh images, and Lena watched the false color composite register a sudden shift from violet to a cold, saturated blue. The timestamps matched to within seconds. She felt the bottom of her rational mind tilt, because synchronized color changes across AU-scale distances aren't how natural fragments behave. Yet that's exactly what the data showed. The main body in space and something else, somewhere, flipping states together. She didn't know about Tom. All she had was a cluster of strange flags lighting up on a real-time anomaly dashboard that some poor software engineer had designed for micrometeorite hits and cosmic ray bursts, not for whatever this was. That night, as she walked the empty hallway out of the lab, her boss caught up to her with the kind of calm voice people use in movies right before the bad news hits, and said, "We've had a request from upstairs to share raw 3I-Atlas telemetry directly with DHS and Strategic Command. They want continuous feed, unfiltered." And just like that, the object stopped being primarily a science target and became a security threat. Tension spiked, then eased a little when nothing exploded. No grids failed, no auroras lit the skies at low latitudes, just a color change, more data, more debates. In Riverton, Tom's own wave of tension broke into something like guilty excitement. In his hands, the fragment was cool, almost painfully smooth, and when he turned off his flashlight there in the field to see it in true darkness, he realized it wasn't glowing as much as editing the light around it, swallowing some hues, reflecting others in that shifting blue pattern that made his eyes ache. He should have been terrified, should have called someone, but instead a different thought crept in. If this is connected to that thing in space, then right now I'm holding a piece of the most important object humanity has ever found. He wrapped it tighter, carried it into his locked garage, and hid it in an old ammo box under a workbench, telling himself it was just for one more night, just until he could drive to the university and show someone he trusted. Halfway across the country, Lena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the color phase graphs in her head, and feeling that scientist's worst fear, being right about something terrible, settle like a stone in her chest. Both of them drifted toward uneasy sleep, while 3I-Atlas continued its slow inbound climb, blue now, its non-gravitational acceleration measurably higher, each spectral scan showing stronger, sharper features, as if it were focusing itself. What they didn't know yet, what would blindside both of them the next day, was that the color changes weren't just modes, they were steps. And blue wasn't the end of the staircase. It was the last landing before something started talking back. The first time the fragment answered, it did it in the quiet